police! Open the door now!
Identify yourself and state your reason.
I don't need to explain myself. This is a welfare check!
I am safe. You have no authority to enter.
You're obstructing an investigation!
You're violating my rights. Leave immediately.
Last warning! Open this door!
The doorbell camera started recording at 2:47 inches the morning when the motion sensor detected movement on the front porch. What it captured over the next 12 minutes would destroy a police officer's career, expose a department's corruption, and result in one of the largest civil rights settlements in the city's history. The woman sleeping peacefully inside had no idea that her quiet Tuesday night was about to become a legal nightmare that would change everything. Before we dive into this incredible story, let me know in the comments where you're watching from tonight. And if you haven't already, please hit that subscribe button, because this case has twists you absolutely won't see coming. Trust me, you're going to want to follow this one all the way through. Judge Rebecca Foster had been on the federal bench for 11 years. At 52 years old, she was known throughout the legal community for her sharp intellect, unwavering fairness, and zero tolerance for constitutional violations. She had presided over hundreds of cases involving police misconduct, civil rights violations, and government overreach. Her rulings were consistently upheld on appeal, and her reputation for protecting individual liberties was legendary among defense attorneys and civil rights advocates. That Tuesday evening, Rebecca had worked late reviewing case files for a complex civil rights lawsuit scheduled for trial the following week. She had finally gotten to bed around midnight, exhausted after a 14-hour day. Her small apartment was located in a quiet residential neighborhood about 15 minutes from the courthouse. She had lived there for 3 years, ever since her divorce, and had never had any problems with neighbors or safety concerns. The building was a converted Victorian house that had been divided into 4 upscale apartments. Rebecca lived on the second floor in a corner unit with large windows overlooking the tree-lined street. She had installed a smart doorbell camera 6 months earlier after her neighbor mentioned some package thefts in the area. It was a simple security measure that she barely thought about. Little did she know that this small device would become the most important piece of evidence in a case that would rock the entire police department. Officer Daniel Rodriguez had been with the Metro Police Department for 8 years. On paper, he looked like a decent cop. He had received several commendations for bravery, maintained a relatively clean disciplinary record, and had even been featured in a local newspaper article about community policing efforts. But beneath the surface, Rodriguez harbored deep resentments and a dangerous sense of entitlement that had been building for years. 3 weeks earlier, Judge Foster had dismissed a drug possession case that Rodriguez had worked for months to build. The dismissal came after she ruled that Rodriguez had conducted an illegal search during a traffic stop, violating the defendant's Fourth Amendment rights. Her written opinion was scathing, describing Rodriguez's testimony as inconsistent and his actions as a clear constitutional violation. The case had been Rodriguez's biggest arrest in months, and he had been counting on the conviction to boost his performance metrics. What made the dismissal even more painful for Rodriguez was that it happened in open court, with other officers watching from the gallery. Judge Foster had methodically dismantled his testimony, pointing out contradictions and inconsistencies that made it clear she didn't believe his version of events. The defense attorney had barely needed to argue. The judge's questions alone had exposed the flaws in Rodriguez's case. After the hearing, Rodriguez had stormed out of the courthouse, muttering angrily to his partner about activist judges and their anti-police agenda. His supervisor had tried to calm him down, explaining that these things happened and that he needed to be more careful about following proper procedures. But Rodriguez wasn't interested in following procedures. He was interested in payback. For 3 weeks, Rodriguez had been driving past Judge Foster's apartment building during his patrol shifts. He had learned her schedule, noting when her lights went on and off, when she arrived home from work, and when she left in the mornings. He told himself he was just keeping an eye on things, making sure the neighborhood was safe. But his partner had started to notice the unusual number of times they ended up on Rebecca's street, especially during night shifts. That Tuesday night, Rodriguez was working alone. His regular partner had called in sick, and the department was short-staffed, so Rodriguez was patrolling solo. He had been in a particularly foul mood all week because another one of his arrests had been thrown out by a different judge who cited Judge Foster's ruling in the Rodriguez case as precedent. It felt like Rebecca Foster was personally sabotaging his career, and his anger had been building to a dangerous level. Around 2:30 the morning, Rodriguez made a decision that would change everything. He parked his patrol car 3 blocks away from Rebecca's building and walked through the shadows to her front porch. He had convinced himself that he was conducting a welfare check, though he had no radio call or reasonable suspicion to justify such an action. In his mind, he was teaching an uppity judge a lesson about respecting law enforcement. The doorbell camera captured Rodriguez as he approached the front door. He was in full uniform, including his utility belt and body camera, though the body camera was conspicuously turned off. He stood on the porch for several minutes, looking around nervously before pressing the doorbell. When no one answered after 30 seconds, he pressed it again, holding the button down longer this time. Inside her apartment, Rebecca was jolted awake by the sound of her doorbell. She glanced at her bedside clock and saw that it was nearly 3 in the morning. Her first thought was that there must be an emergency, perhaps a fire in the building, or some kind of medical situation with one of her neighbors. She grabbed her robe and walked to her front door, checking the peephole. Through the distorted fisheye view, she could see a police officer standing on her porch. This immediately set off alarm bells in her mind. As a federal judge, Rebecca was well aware that she could be a target for disgruntled defendants or their associates. She had received threats before, though none had ever materialized into actual danger. But a police officer showing up at her door in the middle of the night was extremely unusual and potentially concerning. Rebecca called out through the door, asking the officer to identify himself and explain the purpose of his visit. Rodriguez responded by saying he was conducting a welfare check because neighbors had reported suspicious activity around her apartment. This was a lie, and Rebecca knew it. She had been a prosecutor long enough to recognize the signs of an officer who was overstepping his authority. She asked Rodriguez which neighbors had called and what specific suspicious activity they had reported. His answers were vague and contradictory. He claimed someone had called about possible break-in attempts, but when Rebecca pressed for details, he couldn't provide any. She asked for his badge number and the incident report number for the welfare check. Rodriguez became increasingly agitated and demanded that she open the door so he could verify her safety. This is when Rebecca made a smart decision that would prove crucial later. She told Rodriguez that she would not open the door without proper documentation of the welfare check request. She explained that as a federal judge, she received periodic security briefings and was instructed to verify the legitimacy of any law enforcement contact, especially during unusual hours. Rodriguez's response revealed his true intentions. Instead of providing the requested documentation or calling his supervisor to verify the welfare check, he became hostile and threatening. He told Rebecca that she was obstructing a police investigation and that he had the authority to enter her apartment if he believed someone inside was in danger. Rebecca calmly explained that she was obviously safe and accounted for, and that there was no justification for entry. She suggested that if he had legitimate concerns, he should contact the Federal Marshal's Service, which provided security for federal judges. This suggestion seemed to enrage Rodriguez even further. What happened next was captured in crystal clear detail by the doorbell camera. Rodriguez stepped back from the door and appeared to be speaking into his radio, though later investigation would reveal that he never actually called for backup or reported the welfare check to dispatch. He was creating a false narrative, talking to no one while making it appear that he was following proper procedures. After this fake radio conversation, Rodriguez returned to the door and told Rebecca that he had received additional information about an imminent threat to her safety. He claimed that dispatch had informed him that someone had been seen attempting to break into apartments in her building and that he needed to conduct an immediate security sweep of her unit. Rebecca knew this was nonsense. If there had been a real threat to her safety, the Federal Marshal's Service would have been contacted, not a local patrol officer. Moreover, if someone had been breaking into apartments in her building, other residents would have been awakened, Alarms would have been triggered, and there would have been obvious signs of the criminal activity Rodriguez was describing. She firmly told Rodriguez that she would not open her door and that he needed to leave her property immediately. She said she would be contacting the Federal Marshal's Service and his department to report his inappropriate conduct. This is when Rodriguez completely lost control of the situation and made the decision that would end his career and cost his department over $1 million. Have you ever been in a situation where someone in authority was clearly overstepping their bounds? Type yes in the comments if you have. Because what happens next shows exactly why it's so important to stand up for your rights, even when it's difficult. Rodriguez pulled out his radio again, but this time he actually made a call. However, instead of calling his supervisor or requesting backup through proper channels, he called his friend Officer Kevin Walsh, who was off duty but lived nearby. Rodriguez told Walsh that he had a situation with an uncooperative resident who was refusing to comply with a welfare check, and he needed immediate assistance. This call was a massive violation of protocol. Off-duty officers are not supposed to respond to active incidents unless specifically requested through dispatch, and welfare checks should never require multiple officers unless there are clear signs of danger. Rodriguez was essentially calling in an unauthorized favor to help him intimidate a federal judge. While waiting for Walsh to arrive, Rodriguez continued to pound on Rebecca's door and demand entry. He alternated between claiming he was concerned for her safety and threatening her with arrest for obstruction. Rebecca remained calm but firm, repeatedly stating that he had no legal authority to enter her home and that she was documenting everything that was happening. Officer Walsh arrived at 3:15 in the morning, pulling up in his personal vehicle while still wearing civilian clothes. The doorbell camera captured him approaching the porch where Rodriguez was still pounding on Rebecca's door. Walsh looked confused and asked Rodriguez what was really going on. Rodriguez quickly briefed him, spinning a story about a federal judge who was acting erratically and refusing to cooperate with a legitimate welfare check. Walsh should have immediately recognized the red flags. An off-duty officer responding to an incident without being dispatched, no supervisor on scene, and no documentation of the original complaint that supposedly triggered the welfare check. But instead of questioning Rodriguez's actions, Walsh allowed himself to be pulled into the situation. Inside her apartment, Rebecca heard multiple voices outside her door and realized that Rodriguez had called for backup. This escalation convinced her that the situation was spiraling out of control. She quietly moved to her bedroom and called the emergency line for the Federal Marshal's Service. The duty officer who answered was immediately concerned when Rebecca explained that local police were at her door in the middle of the night conducting what appeared to be an unauthorized welfare check. The marshal told Rebecca to remain on the line while he contacted the Metro Police Department's watch commander to verify the legitimacy of the welfare check. He also dispatched 2 federal marshals to Rebecca's location as a precautionary measure. This call would later prove crucial because it created an official record of the incident from Rebecca's perspective, complete with timestamps that matched the doorbell camera footage. Meanwhile, on the porch, Rodriguez was growing increasingly desperate. He had now been at Rebecca's door for over 20 minutes, with nothing to show for it except a growing list of policy violations. Walsh suggested they call their supervisor and get proper authorization for whatever they were trying to accomplish, but Rodriguez insisted they didn't have time for bureaucratic procedures. This is when Rodriguez made his most catastrophic decision. He told Walsh that he could hear sounds from inside the apartment that suggested someone might be in distress. This was completely false. The doorbell camera's audio clearly captured the conversation, and there were no sounds of distress from inside Rebecca's apartment. But Rodriguez was now committed to fabricating an emergency that would justify forced entry. Walsh, who should have known better, went along with Rodriguez's lie. Together, they began loudly announcing that they were hearing suspicious sounds and needed to enter the apartment immediately to ensure Rebecca's safety. They started counting down from 10, threatening to break down the door if Rebecca didn't open it voluntarily. Rebecca, still on the phone with the Federal Marshal's Service, could hardly believe what she was hearing. She informed the duty marshal that the officers were now threatening to break down her door based on completely fabricated claims about sounds of distress. The marshal assured her that help was on the way and instructed her to continue refusing entry while documenting everything. At the count of 0, Rodriguez and Walsh simultaneously shoulder-checked Rebecca's door. The door was solid wood with a quality deadbolt lock, so their first attempt only resulted in loud banging and some damage to the door frame. Undeterred, they backed up and tried again, this time coordinating their efforts more effectively. On the second attempt, the door frame splintered and the door flew open, slamming against the interior wall with a thunderous crash. Rodriguez and Walsh stumbled into Rebecca's apartment with their hands on their weapons, shouting commands for her to show herself and keep her hands visible. Rebecca emerged from her bedroom with her hands raised, still clutching her cell phone. She was wearing a robe over her pajamas and was clearly terrified, but trying to maintain her composure. She immediately identified herself as a federal judge and demanded to know under what authority they had forced entry into her home. Rodriguez, now realizing the magnitude of what he had done, tried to maintain the fiction that they had heard sounds of distress. He claimed they had acted to prevent harm to Rebecca and were conducting a protective sweep of the apartment, but his explanation sounded hollow even to Walsh, who was beginning to understand that they had made a terrible mistake. Rebecca calmly informed both officers that she had been on the phone with the Federal Marshal's Service throughout the entire incident and that federal agents were already en route to her location. She also pointed to her doorbell camera and explained that everything they had done was being recorded in high-definition video with clear audio. The blood drained from Rodriguez's face as the implications hit him. He had just conducted an illegal forced entry into a federal judge's home, lied about the justification for the entry, and done it all in front of a camera that had captured every detail. Walsh looked equally stricken as he realized he had been manipulated into participating in what was clearly going to become a career-ending incident. Rebecca maintained her calm demeanor despite the trauma of having armed officers break down her door in the middle of the night. She informed Rodriguez and Walsh that they needed to leave her apartment immediately and that she would be filing formal complaints with their department as well as federal civil rights violations with the FBI. Rodriguez made one final desperate attempt to salvage the situation. He suggested that they could all agree that this was just a misunderstanding, a welfare check that got out of hand due to poor communication. He implied that if Rebecca didn't make a big deal about it, they could all move on and forget it happened. This suggestion revealed just how little Rodriguez understood about the person he was dealing with. Rebecca had spent her entire career fighting against exactly this type of police misconduct. The idea that she would participate in covering up a clear violation of her constitutional rights was not just naive, but insulting. She firmly told Rodriguez that there would be no cover-up and no quiet resolution. She explained that his actions represented everything wrong with police culture and that she had a duty as a federal judge to ensure that officers who violated citizens' rights faced appropriate consequences. Just as the situation was reaching peak tension, the Federal Marshal's Service arrived. 2 agents approached the apartment with their weapons drawn. Having been briefed that local officers had conducted an unauthorized forced entry into a federal judge's residence, they quickly assessed the situation and took control of the scene. The federal marshals ordered Rodriguez and Walsh to step away from Rebecca and explain their presence in her apartment. Both officers tried to maintain their story about responding to a welfare check, but the marshals were not buying it. They had already been in contact with the Metro Police Department's watch commander, who confirmed that no welfare check had been authorized or dispatched to Rebecca's address. Within minutes, the watch commander himself arrived at the scene, along with 2 patrol supervisors and an internal affairs investigator who had been called out of bed. The watch commander took one look at the broken door, the federal marshals, and Rebecca standing in her robe, and immediately understood that his department was facing a potential catastrophe. Rebecca provided a detailed account of the incident to the internal affairs investigator, while the federal marshals secured the doorbell camera footage as evidence. The video clearly showed Rodriguez approaching the apartment without justification, lying about the reasons for his presence, calling in unauthorized backup, fabricating an emergency, and conducting an illegal forced entry. The watch commander immediately suspended both Rodriguez and Walsh, pending a full investigation. He also ensured that photographs were taken of the damage to Rebecca's door and apartment, and he arranged for emergency repairs to secure her residence for the remainder of the night. By sunrise, word of the incident had reached the highest levels of both the police department and the federal court system. The police chief was awakened at home and briefed on the situation, while the chief judge of the federal district court was also informed that one of his colleagues had been the victim of an apparent police home invasion. The media got wind of the story by mid-morning, and by noon it was the lead story on every local news station. The headline practically wrote itself. Federal judge's home invaded by rogue police officers, entire incident captured on doorbell camera. Rodriguez's personnel file was immediately pulled and reviewed, revealing a pattern of complaints about aggressive behavior and constitutional violations that had been largely ignored by his supervisors. The dismissed drug case that had triggered his vendetta against Rebecca was just the latest in a series of cases where his testimony had been questioned by judges and defense attorneys. Walsh's involvement proved equally damaging to the department's reputation. As an off-duty officer who responded to an unauthorized call for help, he had violated multiple policies and demonstrated the kind of loyalty over law mentality that federal oversight agencies were always looking for in police misconduct cases. The FBI opened a civil rights investigation within 48 hours, treating the incident as a potential criminal conspiracy to deprive Rebecca of her constitutional rights under color of law. This federal statute carried serious felony penalties and could result in significant prison time for both officers. Rebecca hired one of the most prestigious civil rights law firms in the country to represent her in what would inevitably become a major federal lawsuit. The firm had previously won multi-million-dollar settlements against police departments for similar violations, and they immediately recognized that this case had all the elements needed for a substantial verdict. The doorbell camera footage became the centerpiece of both the criminal and civil cases. The video was so clear and comprehensive that it essentially eliminated any possibility of the officers claiming they had acted in good faith or under reasonable circumstances. What made the video even more damaging was the audio quality, which captured every lie Rodriguez told, every threat he made, and every illegal justification he offered for his actions. The footage showed a pattern of escalating misconduct that culminated in an obviously unlawful forced entry into the home of a federal judge. Public reaction to the incident was swift and overwhelmingly negative. Civil rights organizations called for federal intervention in the police department, while legal experts described the incident as one of the most blatant examples of police misconduct they had ever seen. The police union initially tried to defend Rodriguez and Walsh, claiming they had acted in good faith based on their training and experience. But this defense crumbled quickly when the doorbell camera footage was released to the media, showing exactly how the incident had unfolded. Rodriguez was terminated from the police department within 2 weeks of the incident, losing his pension and benefits in the process. Walsh received a slightly lesser punishment of termination without loss of accrued benefits due to his status as a manipulated accomplice rather than the primary instigator. But the legal consequences were just beginning. The federal investigation expanded to include Rodriguez's entire history with the department, focusing on cases where suspects had complained about his conduct but had been ignored by supervisors. The civil lawsuit that Rebecca filed sought damages not just for the immediate harm caused by the illegal entry, but for the broader pattern of constitutional violations that the incident represented. Her legal team argued that Rodriguez's actions were the predictable result of a department culture that tolerated and even encouraged aggressive policing tactics. Have you ever wondered how much a single moment of poor judgment can cost? The answer in this case would prove to be more than anyone could have imagined, and the ripple effects would extend far beyond just 2 officers and 1 judge. The discovery phase of Rebecca's lawsuit revealed a treasure trove of evidence that the police department had desperately hoped would never see daylight. Her legal team, led by veteran civil rights attorney Sarah Chen, subpoenaed Rodriguez's complete personnel file, internal communications between supervisors, and training records dating back 5 years. What they found was a systematic pattern of misconduct that went far beyond one rogue officer's vendetta against a federal judge. Rodriguez had accumulated 17 citizen complaints during his 8-year career, with 14 of those complaints alleging excessive force, racial profiling, or false arrest. Most shocking was the discovery that supervisors had been aware of his escalating behavior but had consistently failed to take meaningful disciplinary action. Internal emails showed that Rodriguez's sergeant had joked about his aggressive tactics, referring to him as their problem solver when dealing with difficult suspects. The department's training records revealed another damning piece of evidence. Rodriguez had failed his annual constitutional law refresher course 3 times in the past 2 years, yet he had been allowed to remain on active duty. The course specifically covered Fourth Amendment protections and the circumstances under which officers could lawfully enter private residences. His repeated failures should have triggered additional training or suspension, but supervisors had simply penciled in passing grades. Walsh's involvement proved to be even more problematic for the department's defense. Text messages recovered from his phone showed that Rodriguez had been complaining about Judge Foster for weeks leading up to the incident. In one particularly damaging exchange, Rodriguez had written that he wanted to teach the judge a lesson about disrespecting cops. Walsh had responded with laughing emojis and suggestions about how they could make her life difficult. These communications transformed the case from a simple excessive force claim into something much more serious, a federal conspiracy charge. The FBI expanded their investigation to include potential charges of criminal conspiracy, deprivation of rights under color of law, and making false statements to federal investigators. The media coverage intensified when details of Rodriguez's personnel file became public through court filings. Investigative reporters began tracking down his previous victims, many of whom had been too intimidated or too poor to fight back against his misconduct. A picture emerged of an officer who had been targeting vulnerable citizens for years while his department looked the other way. Maria Santos, a single mother who had been arrested by Rodriguez 2 years earlier, came forward with her story. She described how Rodriguez had conducted an illegal search of her car during a routine traffic stop, planted evidence when he found nothing, and then threatened her children when she tried to file a complaint. Her case had been dismissed when the judge found Rodriguez's testimony incredible, but the department had taken no action against him. James Wilson, a college student, shared his experience of being beaten by Rodriguez during what should have been a simple jaywalking citation. Wilson had ended up in the hospital with a broken wrist and multiple bruises, but Rodriguez's report claimed that Wilson had attacked him first. The incident had been caught on a nearby business's security camera, clearly showing Rodriguez as the aggressor, but the footage had mysteriously disappeared from evidence storage. These stories began appearing in local newspapers and television reports, creating a public relations nightmare for the police department. The chief found himself holding daily press conferences, trying to reassure the community that Rodriguez was an isolated case and that reforms were already being implemented. But the damage to the department's credibility was spreading beyond just Rodriguez's cases. Defense attorneys throughout the city began filing motions to dismiss cases involving any officer who had worked with Rodriguez or had been supervised by his sergeant. The contamination effect was destroying months of police work and allowing serious criminals to escape prosecution. The city's insurance company, which would ultimately be responsible for paying any settlement or judgment, began pressuring city officials to resolve the case quickly. Their risk assessment team had reviewed the doorbell camera footage and concluded that the city had virtually no chance of winning at trial. They recommended accepting whatever settlement terms Rebecca's lawyers demanded. Rebecca's legal team knew they had tremendous leverage, but they weren't interested in just a quick financial settlement. Chen and her colleagues wanted systematic reforms that would prevent future incidents. They demanded the creation of an independent civilian oversight board, mandatory body cameras for all officers, psychological evaluations for officers with multiple complaints, and a complete overhaul of the department's internal affairs process. The negotiations dragged on for months while the federal criminal investigation continued. Rodriguez and Walsh had both been indicted on multiple federal charges, and their trials were scheduled to begin just as the civil case was reaching its climax. The timing created additional pressure on the city to settle, as a criminal conviction would make their civil liability even more obvious. During depositions, the full scope of the department's dysfunction became clear. The chief admitted under oath that he had never personally reviewed Rodriguez's complaint file, despite the obvious pattern of misconduct. The internal affairs commander couldn't explain why so many complaints had been dismissed without proper investigation. Supervisors claimed they had never been trained on how to identify problem officers or when to recommend termination. Most damaging of all was the deposition of Rodriguez's former partner, who had been granted immunity in exchange for his testimony. He described a culture where aggressive tactics were encouraged and constitutional violations were routine. He admitted that he had witnessed Rodriguez plant evidence on at least 3 occasions, but had never reported it because he feared retaliation from other officers. The psychological evaluation ordered by Rebecca's legal team revealed the lasting trauma caused by the incident. Dr. Elizabeth Harper, a specialist in post-traumatic stress, documented how the home invasion had affected Rebecca's sense of security and ability to function normally. She described sleep disturbances, hypervigilance, and anxiety that had persisted for months after the incident. Rebecca had been forced to move to a new apartment because she could no longer feel safe in her original home. She had installed extensive security systems and had difficulty sleeping without multiple locks and alarms. The woman who had fearlessly presided over dangerous criminal cases was now afraid of unexpected knocks on her door. The financial impact extended beyond just Rebecca's personal suffering. The incident had disrupted her work schedule, forcing her to postpone several important trials while she dealt with the aftermath. Court administrators had to reassign cases and reschedule hearings, creating delays that affected dozens of other parties. The ripple effects of Rodriguez's actions were still being felt months later. Public pressure for reform reached a crescendo when the local newspaper published a comprehensive investigation into the police department's disciplinary practices. The series revealed that the department had paid out over $2 million in misconduct settlements over the previous 5 years, yet only 3 officers had been terminated for cause during that same period. Community activists organized protests outside the police station and city hall, demanding accountability and transparency. Religious leaders held prayer vigils calling for justice and reform. The incident had become a symbol of everything wrong with police culture and the need for fundamental change. The federal oversight team that had been monitoring the department issued a scathing report documenting systemic failures in training, supervision, and accountability. They recommended placing the entire department under a federal consent decree, which would require court-approved reforms and ongoing monitoring for years to come. City council members began calling for the police chief's resignation, arguing that the department's problems were too deep-seated for incremental reform. The mayor found himself caught between defending his appointee and responding to overwhelming public pressure for change. Rodriguez's criminal trial began in federal court with massive media attention. The courtroom was packed with reporters, civil rights advocates, and curious citizens who wanted to see justice served. The prosecution's case was straightforward. The doorbell camera footage spoke for itself, showing a clear violation of Rebecca's constitutional rights under color of law. Rodriguez's defense attorney tried to argue that his client had genuinely believed he was conducting a legitimate welfare check, but this argument crumbled under cross-examination. The prosecutor methodically demonstrated that Rodriguez had lied about receiving a complaint, lied about hearing sounds of distress, and lied about having authority to enter Rebecca's apartment. The jury deliberated for less than 4 hours before returning guilty verdicts on all charges. Rodriguez was sentenced to 18 months in federal prison, followed by 2 years of supervised release. Walsh received a lighter sentence of 6 months home confinement and community service due to his cooperation with investigators and his status as a secondary participant. The criminal convictions eliminated any remaining doubt about the city's civil liability. Rebecca's legal team had been seeking $8 million in damages, but the city's negotiators were now willing to discuss settlement terms that just months earlier would have been unthinkable. The final settlement agreement reached 1 year after the incident shocked even experienced civil rights attorneys. Rebecca would receive $1.2 million in compensatory damages for her pain and suffering, plus an additional $500,000 to fund police reform initiatives of her choosing. The total package of $1.7 million was among the largest settlements ever paid for a police misconduct case in the city's history. But the monetary settlement was only part of the agreement. The city also committed to implementing a comprehensive reform package that would transform how the police department operated. Every officer would be required to wear body cameras during all public interactions. A civilian oversight board with subpoena power would review all use of force incidents and citizen complaints. Officers with multiple complaints would face mandatory psychological evaluation and additional training. Rodriguez lost everything that night: his career, his pension, his freedom, and his future, all because he couldn't accept that a federal judge had done her job correctly. Rebecca Foster proved that accountability isn't just possible, it's inevitable when brave people stand up for what's right and technology captures the truth. That doorbell camera didn't just record an incident, it recorded justice in action. This case was disturbing, but the one on the right ends in a way no one expects.